Hey guys, how are all of you doing? Hope fine, and yes, this is the next part of Game of Shadow in Naruto world. Where I am in the Naruto world. I have a name that isn't mine and I have a really nerfed version of the gamer. Is that all? Am I forgetting something? Right, inventory. At that I received yet another disappointment. Let's start without any delay. Naruto Uzumaki. I hate this, he said, his face twitching as he stopped himself from grimacing. Sasuke grunted from beside him, their eyes locked not on each other but on someone else in the room. Ig, to be precise, who laid on the hospital bed, unmoving and pale. Sometimes they would wonder if he was actually dead, with his skin so pale and the black veins still present everywhere in his body. Those were the worst moments and why everyone in the group always visited with someone else. They didn't want to be alone when seeing their friend in the state he was in. It was like a twisted joke, really. Their plans had worked, everything had gone well. The invasion had been stopped, casualties were said to be reasonably low, or at least that's how Kakashi had told it to their team. Everyone in their group had escaped the whole disaster fine. Everyone except Ig. The one that had made the most plans, the one that had probably done the most, at least in their group. Why was he the one that was in a coma? How was that fair? What good is having this power if it still wasn't enough? Naruto couldn't help but wonder. The fox's chakra had made him stronger, faster, more durable. He'd been able to fight the woman, Yujito, together with the swordsman, Zabuza, his name was, but he should have been able to fight her by himself, shouldn't he? They were almost the same thing. She had a different demon, but it was close enough, right? Why was she in so much more control than he was? Naruto racked his brain ever since, trying to come up with a way to work better with the fox chakra. However, the fight during the invasion was a one-time deal, he knew. He was keeping his promise and working on his mindscape, as Ig had called it, making it into something much nicer than a sewer. It was hard, but he'd made a deal with the fox and Naruto Uzumaki didn't go back on his word. Now though, he couldn't use that again to get the fox's cooperation. With that in mind, he'd started talking more with the Kyuubi to try and see if there was a way he could get it to help him. Not an easy task to set himself on, that was for sure. The damn furball was always in a bit of a mood. It was either I'll eat you and all those you are about. Or why should I care about my jailer? Or somewhere in between those. Still, Naruto was nothing if not stubborn and he knew it. He'd been dealing with angry and annoyed people his whole life. He'd put up with the fox's attitude if it helped him be stronger the next time he needed to be. This was the last time he would have to see one of his friends in a hospital bed like this, that Naruto swore to himself. He'd much rather be the one that was on the bed. He felt so helpless just sitting there and looking at him. Time will be up soon, Sasuke reminded him. Right, Naruto nodded stiffly. Same place. The Uchiha grunted in response. And that was that. That was their routine, more or less. They went to the hospital, then they went to a training ground, usually with Sakura if she wanted to join, which she usually did, and then they would do D-rank missions in the afternoons. Kakashi-sensei had agreed easily enough after they voiced what they preferred to do. Where they'd been eager to do C-ranks before, now they preferred the chores for a very simple reason. Those missions were short and they were always inside Konoha. That meant that they would always be close by if Ig woke up. When he wakes up, Naruto corrected in his mind. At least the chores didn't feel so pointless anymore, so there was that. After all, many D-rank missions those days revolved around helping the village recover from the invasion. Moving rubble, repairing houses, helping make and deliver food, etc. etc. IG said you were training in the mindscape thing, Naruto said as they walked out of the hospital, and he saw his teammate tense up. Feeling more than a little nervous himself, he kept on, if only so he wouldn't regret his decision. I'm doing that too, he admitted. The Uchiha remained silent for a long moment, but Naruto saw his eyes move towards him occasionally. Why? Because of. He looked around, to see if someone was close. Nobody was, but he was suddenly hesitant to say that in a public place. I'll tell you at the training grounds. I thought maybe we could work on that together. He finally managed to say what he wanted. It's very difficult. IG makes it sound easy, Sasuke said then, almost grumbling, and Naruto felt his lips quirk up. I know, right? He asked, indignation clear in his voice, although that was contradicted by the grin that had formed on his face. The bastard goes on and on like it's the easiest thing in the world. Sasuke grunted, and Naruto took that as an affirmation. The Uzumaki pretended to ignore the way the Uchiha's lips quirked up the smallest bit. There was no use in pointing that out, he knew. Getting anything resembling a smile from people in the group always felt like a victory to him, though. His efforts to cheer everyone up were often joined by Chaoji and sometimes Ino, since they were the most cheerful of the bunch. Although, it was hard to succeed when even they had trouble smiling sometimes. The group had been somewhat divided since graduation. It was normal for them to meet up and for there to be a member that couldn't go because of training or missions. They'd gotten used to that with time. Now though, it was like all that didn't matter. Every time they would meet, they felt the glaring absence of one of them. Every day that passed like that became worse instead of better. Naruto turned his head towards where the hospital was. Sasuke, next to him, didn't comment. Moreover, he himself turned towards the same direction, and the Uzumaki wondered if he was thinking the same thing as he. Wake up soon, IG, he thought, imagining that his brother could hear him. Oh. Anko Mitarashi. No news, she informed with a distant tone. The two spiders in front of her sagged, disappointed. It would have been comical, with the spider the size of a building doing that, if not for the circumstances. Neither Kumohoshi nor Shirakumo had returned to their summon realm after finding out about what happened to their contractor. They refused to do that, apparently, until IG woke up, or there were, at the very least, positive news about his state. Anko had been surprised, really. She'd never heard of summons being so concerned for their contractor. Even less so seeing as they were spiders of all things. Although, considering that most of her experiences were with the snakes and they were the clan that actually wanted to serve Orochimaru, she guessed she wasn't the best judge for that. You are still puzzled by our presence here, the chief spider spoke then, after a moment of silence. Anko had to admit, at least in her own mind, that being stared at by those 8 big, beady red eyes was more than a little intimidating. Especially when they were on such a massive, very dangerous creature. Are you, Anko? The smaller Shirakumo spoke, tilting her head in an adorable motion that shouldn't be possible by a spider of all things. It contrasted even more with the very frightening sight of her mother. How these two could be related was beyond the Takubetsu Jounin. Why though? IG is a friend of the Spider Clan. Because she doesn't understand what that means, Kumohoshi answered her granddaughter's question for her. And she didn't know about that to begin with. I'm afraid we may have forgotten to mention that while worrying about young Ig. Oh. I, didn't forget. I just thought you should be the one to tell her, Shirakumo mumbled, turning her eyes away from the other two. It's adorable that she thinks anyone will believe that, Anko thought to herself, a smile almost forming on her face. Almost. Ig helped our clan with 2 people we had marked as enemies of the clan. That is only done to those who have wronged us in an unforgivable manner, those who we've decided must die, the spider declared. The only reason we haven't already tried to kill Orochimaru is because he's wronged your people in much the same manner. He must die in the end though, after you are done with him. We'll make sure of that. The way she spoke, she was stating a fact. Orochimaru would die if the Spider Clan had any say in the matter. Anko shuddered to think what would happen to her if she were in a similar situation. Maybe she should count herself lucky that the Snake Clan didn't quite see her as an enemy on that level. Ig was a key element in our revenge. He gave us the chance and even took part on the death of one of said enemies himself. However, indirectly, Kumohoshi continued, bringing to Anko's mind her meeting with Asuma when the Jounin had approached her to deliver her student's sword to her, since he was indisposed. She'd hated that day. For that, our clan owes him. I'm sure he won't see it that way, Anko pointed out with a wry smile that didn't last long. And I'm sure you are right, the chief spider nodded, a weird sight even after knowing her for months. Fortunately for him, he doesn't have a say in the matter. So, is there anything you two need over here? Anko asked, rocking on her heels. I want to look at Orochimaru some more, it's always good entertainment, she joked with a grin. He'll be okay, Kumohoshi replied, completely ignoring her question, and the Mitarashi froze. Our contractor is stronger than most think he is, and that is saying something. He'll wake up. Anko's shoulders sagged and she took a painful breath in. Those days, it seemed like she always had a knot on her throat, sometimes tighter, sometimes not, but it was always there. I should have been there, she thought every time. She almost wished Ig had never succeeded in breaking Kabuto for his information. If they hadn't had that, they wouldn't have placed most of their defenses and ninja on the village borders. After all, they had had a good idea of the snake's plans. Except they didn't. Kumo's inclusion and the Nibi Jinchuriki's sabotage had not only decreased their efforts' results, but they had also made it so that a bunch of genin was about the only thing that had remained near the arena. And that was why Ig had to fight Killer Bee alone for as long as he did. To add salt into the wound, the only help her student had gotten was someone from one of the villages that were attacking them. Furthermore, Ig had been the one to convince him to do so. Where had she been through all that? Halfway across the village, dealing with the Kumonin that had taken everyone by surprise. By the time she'd arrived at the arena again, the fight was all but over and her student had laid on the floor, unresponsive. It wasn't your fault, Kumohoshi spoke again, and Anko looked down, seeing Shirakumo had approached her. Ig wouldn't blame you, the small, white spider told her. Doesn't mean I can't blame myself, Anko replied with a smile that held no mirth nor happiness. What kind of teacher isn't there when their student is in danger? That was a question she'd been asking herself a lot. How many times had Ig needed help and she'd been next to useless? You hold the snake contract, do you not? Kumohoshi asked then, and the Takubetsu Jounin turned to her, confused. By the tone of her voice, Anko had the distinct impression that the spider was smiling. A smile she was sure didn't bode well for someone. Oh. Kurotsuchi. Why am I here? She wondered, looking around at the white walls and the window of the room. Kuropsachi pointedly refused to look at either of the boys currently with her. She also stubbornly ignored the fact that she was in there for one of said boys. After all, she was inside IG Sata's hospital room. As if the fact that she had wanted to visit the comatose boy wasn't confusing enough, Kuropsachi had found another, much more inexplicable occurrence when she crossed the door. Gara, his name was, the brother of the ones that had helped her with her attackers during the invasion. He was also the son of the fourth Kazekage, which made his rather controversial participation during the attack even stranger. He was also the one that had tried to kill her in the forest during the second test. At least that explained why there seemed to be extra security outside the room. Kuropsachi was sure that there was also someone or something in the room too. She couldn't see Konoha leaving the unconscious boy alone in a room with two prominent foreign ninja, let alone one from a village that had attacked them. Even less so if that boy seemed to be rather prominent himself. "Why are you here?" Gara's question snapped her from her thoughts and she turned sharply towards him. He wasn't looking at her though. Instead, the boy was staring at the satyr's lying form. For a moment, Kuropsachi wondered if that question had even been directed at her. "Why did you visit?" "Well, that answered her unasked question. I heard he convinced you and your siblings to help." Kuropsachi started as an answer. "They helped with my battle, along with one of his friends," she explained, waving her hand towards the boy lying on the room's bed. "So I guess I wanted to thank him, even if he is still unconscious," the girl finished, looking away. While that much was true, it also didn't feel like the current answer and she couldn't help but wondered why. 2 times now had IG Sata saved her life. 3 if she counted the Uchiha and the Suna siblings separately. Did the addition of the spiders count? Kuropsachi found herself increasingly more frustrated the more she thought about that. She hated that she'd needed help, that she'd needed saving like some princess in a children's story. Some genius I am, huh? She thought, her lip twitching up in a self-deprecating smirk. She couldn't even be angry with Sata, since he'd been looking out for his village, not for her, just like he'd said in the forest. She almost snorted, remembering that conversation had taken place shortly after he'd saved her from the other boy in the room. Which was why she refused to look at him for long. His sole presence reminded her about how she almost died by his sand during the second test. Why am I staying in the room with him? Kuropsachi wondered. Why don't I just go and come back some other time? Why are you here? She asked back instead. Because I'm his friend, Gara answered, taking her aback. That certainly wasn't the kind of answer she'd expected from him. Then again, he seemed to be remarkably different from the ninja she'd met inside the forest. Was that Sata's doing too? I was told it would be something a friend would do. Now that fit her mental image of him a little better. So you aren't here because you were concerned? Kuropsachi asked, although she wasn't even sure why she did so. I guess in a way I was, he answered this time, sounding as unsure as his words did. If he doesn't wake up, I won't know what having a friend is like. Kuropsachi didn't know how to feel about that. Should she pity him? She didn't think so. She wasn't surprised that he didn't have friends if he'd always acted like he did at the beginning of the Chunin exams. On the other hand, she kind of understood him a little better then. Not on the friendship side but on how he felt about Sata not waking up. After all, if he didn't, then Kuropsachi wouldn't be able to repay him for saving her. That possibility infuriated her a lot more than the fact that she'd needed saving in the first place. She didn't want to owe anyone. Are you here because you are concerned? Gaara asked then, and she could only blink, surprised. Why was he sending that question back to her? She'd already given a reason, hadn't she? Didn't I already say why I was here? She asked with a frown. You say that it was because you wanted to thank him, he nodded. Kurosachi didn't know if the fact that he hadn't once let his eyes stray away from Sata was unnerving or just weird. If you wanted to do that, wouldn't it be better to just wait for him to wake up to do that? To that, she didn't have an answer. Once again, she found herself annoyed. That was happening to her a lot, she realized. It was all Sata's fault, she was sure. Kurosachi would be sure to give the boy a piece of her mind once he woke up. Honestly, how did he even manage to be so incredibly infuriating while also doing nothing wrong? Maybe it was a bloodline or some. Are you a friend of his too? Gaara asked this time, apparently having decided that she wouldn't reply to his question. Wisely so, because she didn't know the answer herself. Are you here because of that? Kurosachi blinked a few times before his mind pieced together that question with what he'd said before, about being told visiting was something a friend would do. She opened her mouth to deny that before pausing and closing it. For the first time since she entered the room, her eyes moved towards Sata, lying there, silent, pale and sickly. Then her eyes moved towards the Sunanin and back to the reason they were both there. I guess I am. Oh. Hiruzen Sarutobi. The Hokage was almost amused by the state his old friend was in. Danza seemed to grow more restless as time passed and his student's condition remained unchanged. It would have been amusing, really, if it weren't for the fact that a restless Danza was a dangerous Danza. That translated into increasingly worse deal ideas for Suna and Kumo. While they had the support of Iwa and Kiri, Hiruzen didn't want to risk angering the other nations too much. Contained as they were, he had no delusions that the Raikage and the two Jinchuriki could break out of their cells at any time. The only reason they weren't doing just that and going back to their village was because that would be a bad idea for everyone involved, them included. On the other hand, they would cause trouble if Konoha pushed them too much, and that was precisely what Hiruzen wanted to avoid. Still, he understood. Danza wasn't the only one that wanted their attackers to face punishment. The Hyuga clan was out for blood too, since they had been specifically targeted by Kumo again. This time, they wouldn't content themselves with the diplomatic way and Hiruzen couldn't fault them for that. He supposed he should just be happy that the clan was now more supportive of their alliance with Kiri after one of their ninja helped during the invasion. He should thank Iji for that, since the Nara heir had told him about all of the Sata's plans during that day. Even Danza had been happy with his students' decisions, even if the one regarding the mist grated on him a bit. After all, Iji had promised Kiri that he would pass New Iberi on to one of their ninja eventually. Returning the legendary sword to their nation in a traditional way that wouldn't have him killed. More than one would grumble at the loss of such a weapon for Konoha, one such person being Danza. Regardless, Hiruzen commended the boy for that. He might have decided to eventually give up an incredibly powerful weapon, but doing so he'd gained an equally incredible amount of goodwill with the mist. Even the Shimura couldn't deny that it was a good trade. Moreover, if anyone wanted to complain despite that, then they could take it to all the people in the council that had benefited from that decision. The Hyuga, the Nara, the Yamanaka, the Aburam, all of which had their heirs all but saved with the intervention of the Kiri ninja. Moreover, when someone tried to point out that their heirs had joined the fight out of their own volition, they had pointed out that if they hadn't, the people of Konoha would have had to face 2 Jinchuriki that were in synchrony with their Baijua. That usually shot down any argument since no one wanted to be the one to face that. Hiruzen himself wouldn't tolerate anyone speaking badly of the Satter's decisions, be them the sword trade or reaching out to the Suna siblings. After all, his plans had also seen the Hokage himself getting much needed help in a time of need. Even if the fight outside of the barrier had been going in their favor, Hiruzen hadn't been optimistic about their chances inside it. He shuddered to think what Orochimaru would have unleashed on the Leaf after the Kages were no longer able to fight the resurrected individuals. Even if Hiruzen had gone for Plan B and used the dead demon-consuming seal, what would have happened to his village afterwards? With no leader, would their seemingly budding alliances with Kiri and Iwa be lost? Would someone pick up quickly enough to save those? He trusted Danzo with a lot of things, but even the Shimura himself thought he was more of a last resort for the position than an actual candidate. He was just too used to the shadows to be in such a public position. Hiruzen owed the Satter, but, more importantly, Konoha owed him. Maybe you could get those Jinchuriki to help ours gain the same power they have, Danzo spouted then, breaking the Hokage from his thoughts. God knows they owe us something, Hiruzen. That's actually a good idea, Hiruzen nodded, being completely honest. It was probably the only good idea Danzo had given for a while, since he'd gotten increasingly more vicious with his demands. Speaking of, I have another one. Oh, do tell. The man replied with a raised eyebrow. Hiruzen could imagine him hiding a sneer, probably thinking that he was going to say something about a more peaceful arrangement. Something that Danzo didn't like hearing one bit. Fortunately, Hiruzen wasn't going to say something about that, for now. I'll send Jiraiya after Tsunade, the Hokage announced, the decision already set in his mind. That brought his old friend to a stop as he narrowed his eye and stood straighter. Hiruzen was sure he knew exactly why he had decided to bring his other student back. After all, she was known for 2 things, terrible luck when gambling and her medical prowess. They were in need of one of those to repay a loyal ninja of their village. This isn't only about the Satter, Danzo stated more than asked as his eye narrowed even more, staring at him suspiciously. Hiruzen simply smirked. It seemed he'd been caught. Maybe his friend had the time to prepare a heir from a young age, but he didn't have that benefit, and, if recent events were anything to go by, he needed to have someone ready to take the mantle from him. Maybe even take it immediately. He was getting too old to continue in the position. He had passed the title on to Minato for a reason, after all. Hopefully they would be prepared if anything like the invasion happened again. Apparently, that was not to be. Both Hiruzen and Danzo tensed when they felt 2 rather powerful individuals approaching his office. They would have been much more nervous if they hadn't known it was Mai and Onaki. However, the fact that their chakra seemed to be in a turmoil didn't precisely fill them with confidence. "We have a problem," was the first thing the new Mitsukage announced once she stepped through the door. And if her words weren't ominous enough, the expressions on both her and the Sashikage certainly were. "I really need to retire," Hiruzen thought to himself, hiding a grimace. Hiruzen saw Rutabi. This was bad, very bad. He sat behind his desk, facing both Mai and Onaki, who sat on the other side on an armchair each. Danzo, meanwhile, stood next to the desk on his left, with a scowl on his face. The Hokage didn't blame him though, the situation certainly deserved the expression and much more. The Mist's Jinchuriki of the 6 tails had been attacked and lost. The Stone's Jinchuriki of the 4 tails had been attacked and lost. both of them roughly at the same time as the invasion in the leaf was taking place. That's no coincidence, Hiruzen thought, disturbed. If this didn't prove that A's claims about someone controlling him were true, then the Hokage didn't know what could. After all, Orochimaru was dangerous, yes, and he could take on a Jinchuriki if he tried hard enough, but he had been in Konoha at the time. Hiruzen also rather doubted that his former student had anyone under his control to pull off such a feat, let alone in two different nations at the same time. No, there was something else at play here. Rather convenient that the Cloud still has both of their Jinchuriki, Danza pointed out, and Hiruzen had to stop himself from reacting to that. His old friend was right, of course, but he could have pointed that out at a less inconvenient time. The Hokage could almost see another war breaking out if any more tension was put on them. He also saw the same struggle behind Onaki's eyes, which brought Hiruzen a measure of relief. He had his suspicions, but this pretty much confirmed that the current Sashikage would very much like to avoid another war breaking out. He guessed it made sense, the both of them had seen much in their long lives. The last thing they wanted to experience was the bloodshed that came from one. Especially in Onaki's case, he supposed, after what Iwa had suffered during the last one. The same could not be said about Mai, however, who looked positively murderous. He guessed that made sense too, the woman had barely gotten her country back. Her efforts had been focused on bringing a semblance of normality to it after so many years of being the bloody mist, and now this happened. Mai's very position was in danger now. After all, what kind of kid lost a Jinchuriki? It also didn't help that her village was weak enough after so many years of civil war. They couldn't afford to lose an asset like that. Now there would be people judging her every move if she hadn't earned enough loyalty from the people under her. Hiruzen hoped she had. Mai certainly seemed to be a reasonable enough person to work with, if their previous interactions were anything to go by. On the other hand, from the Hokage's side though, this development wasn't entirely bad. It only increased the value of Ige's trade regarding New Ivory. If the mist had lost so much power now, they would be even more happy with earning some back, even if there were some that would say a legendary sword wasn't on par with Jinchuriki. With some luck, that would assuage some of Danza's attitude, or this meeting would be even worse than he was anticipating. I'm rather surprised that you shared this information with us, Onaki, Hiruzen mused, meaning every word. He wasn't sure how to take this token of trust coming from the Sashikage. After all, it revealed weakness on their side. I find myself wondering about that too, Mai voiced, letting go of her anger for a moment, even if the frown was still present as she regarded Onaki. This is greater than my pride, the diminutive man replied, sounding like it pained him to say as much. Whoever is behind this is a threat, even more so if they are the same. Madara that speaks of that, and the last thing I want is another world shinobi war, the man admitted, albeit with extreme reluctance, by the looks of it. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to add something else to that, but ultimately remained silent. For the moment Danza spoke, and Hiruzen almost closed his eyes to wish for the man to express something that wouldn't cause the other leaders to snap. I think you should focus on defending the Jinchuriki that you still have. Mai's whole body twitched at that. Understandable, really, since the remaining Jinchuriki in Kirigakure was probably buried in the deepest, darkest hole they had been able to find. After all, he was Yagura Karatakai, the previous Mitsukage and the man that had spearheaded the Bloody Mist. Although, with the information that was coming to light as of late, I guess we should, Onaki agreed, pointedly ignoring Mai's reaction. The woman herself visibly calmed herself, taking a deep breath in and nodding stiffly. Any results in the investigation regarding the cloud? The Sushikage asked then, narrowing his eyes at the same time as the current Mitsukage. It's going slow, as expected, Hiruzen informed them, closing his eyes for a moment. However, what the Yamanaka have been able to verify so far makes us think he is telling the truth. It was unfortunate, but even with a willingly letting them use the Yamanaka techniques on him to see if he was telling the truth, they simply couldn't trust that easily. Thus, Inoichi himself was checking that, making sure that what he saw in the Reikage's mind was actually the truth, and he hadn't managed to find a way to fool the Mindwalker's approaches. Onaki grunted, clearly annoyed by the whole situation. We must know that quickly. If they are not lying, then there's someone acting against all of us. Meaning that we could have a common enemy and not have to fight each other, Hiruzen added in his mind, hearing what the Sushikage was saying and what he wasn't. Indeed, someone that all of them could direct their hostility towards would go a long way to avoid another war breaking out and appeasing those who wanted one. For the moment, at least. Oh. Naruto Uzumaki. This sucks, he grumbled, closing his eyes, frowning and pouting. He was getting more and more annoyed the more time passed. Why was it so goddamn difficult to do this? Just imagine it, and then force it to become what you want it to be, he replayed Iji's words in his mind. Although, the satyr had clearly not added the mocking tone that Naruto did. Just wait until you wake up, Iji. I'll kick your ass for this. What are you complaining about? A growling voice asked. Some time ago, the blonde boy would have been scared shitless at the sound of it. Now though, it was just another part of his normal days. Well, as normal as a mountain-sized bunny-eared fox could be, that is. Which wasn't much, but the fact that he could put normal in the same sentence as that was weird enough. I've had to live here for years and you start whining already. The fox said, unimpressed. It's not that. Naruto denied, whining as he did so. It's just that changing this god-awful place to make it look nice is a pain in the ass. For a moment, the Uzumaki wondered if Sasuke was having better luck than he. After all, they had both decided to tackle their mindscapes at the same time so that they could talk about it afterwards. For a moment, the tailed beast remained silent, before letting out a snort that Naruto wasn't sure if it was out of actual amusement or if it was mocking. So, that's what you've been doing all this time. I thought you were meditating or something. After all, nothing's changed in all your visits, has it? The fox commented, and the blonde felt his eyebrow twitch repeatedly. The worst part was that the demon wasn't wrong. I know that, Naruto mumbled lowly, his voice barely audible even if there wasn't much of anything to hear in the sewers they were in. And things have changed, stupid fox, he added, not sounding particularly proud. After all, the only thing he'd managed to do was clean up the walls and the water a bit. At least he'd found a way to change things in the mindscape, he supposed. He just had to take what was already there and alter it a bit instead of trying to make something from scratch. Well, actually, Sasuke had been the one to find out that, but at least Naruto was having better luck at applying that knowledge. That made it a draw, right? He'd count it like that. Shouldn't have made a promise that you couldn't keep, human, the fox said behind him from inside his cage, and Naruto flinched as if struck. And I shouldn't have listened. It won't happen again, the being added with a growl. I can do this. Naruto protested, standing and turning towards the beast. Just you wait. This will be better looking than the outside when I'm done here, believe it. And I'm supposed to believe it, why exactly? The fox asked, and he grimaced. It had a point there. Deflating, Naruto looked around for a bit before turning to the orange-furred monster. "Hey, furball," he started, ignoring both the question and the indignant what of the creature as he looked around at the sewers. "How would you change this for the better?" "I can't change much, apparently. I could barely clean the place up as it is." "Any ideas?" he asked, frowning at the sight that surrounded him. "So, not only are you incapable of what you said you would do, but now you want my help doing it?" "Wow, just wow," the fox voiced, clearly unimpressed with his host. "Could have just said no," Naruto grumbled to himself, still trying to think of something to do to improve the feeling of the sewer at least a bit. "You could add some lights, at least," the fox mocked, and the blonde could almost see it snarl even without turning towards it. "The dark tunnels certainly aren't nice." Naruto blinked and then blinked again. Then, he opened his mouth to point out that for all the talking he did, the fox had ended up helping anyway. Ultimately though, he closed his mouth and just focused on trying to do as the beast said. After all, if interacting with Sasuke had taught him anything, it was that when dealing with a person with an attitude, one had to ignore that type of thing. "This still isn't easy," Naruto thought with a grimace. It had been a good while since Fox's suggestion and he still had made little progress. "I have to shape the lights, after all. It isn't like cleaning, where I could just change colors and that was about." "Wait." Narrowing his eyes, he concentrated on something simple. "Not making bulbs or anything of the sort." "No. Instead, he just willed light to exist on the roof." After all, he didn't need anything to make a way for the light to appear, just make that light directly, right? Turns out, it was exactly as he thought it would be. From where there definitely couldn't come, light appeared. Because, after all, this was his mind, not the real world. He could make whatever he wanted here. Whatever. He frowned at where he'd put the light. Soon enough, the roof started bending. The curve on it turned flat and the circular, tube-like structure of the sewer changed into a square. After a moment, the thing looked more like a hole with water on the floor than a sewer. "Oh!" the fox exclaimed from behind Naruto, sounding interested. "So, finally got the hang of it." The blonde ignored the beast's mocking tone and grinned from ear to ear. "Oh! Sasuke-uchiha." He was frustrated. Although, being fair, frustration was something he was familiar with. This time though, it was with how little progress he was making in training. That was something he wasn't familiar with. After all, he'd always been praised as a prodigy, even if nowhere near the levels Itachi had reached, nor Ig for that matter. However, this time, his progress was so little, so painfully slow, that he couldn't help but be frustrated. It had been months since Orochimaru had marked him with his cursed seal. Months since Ig had taken some of his time to help him work on his mindscape to build defenses against the mark. He'd even been receiving constant checks and lessons from Yamanaka. The results he'd gotten since then. A small, pitifully thin and glass-like barrier separating the rest of his mindscape from the fake Orochimaru that took residence in him, together with the same purple flame /energy that Ig had described from his own experiences. It was pathetic, really, that such a weak defense was the only thing that protected him from being controlled by the person that had orchestrated the invasion Konoha had just survived. The fake Orochimaru could easily break it too, to add salt to the wound. Sasuke knew because every time he entered his mindscape, he'd find the barrier broken and the shade of the snake Sunin sitting right there, in the middle of the remaining shards. Every single time was like that, and he hated the smug look Orochimaru would send him. as if he was merely amused by his struggles to contain him. Every single time, he'd have to repair the barrier and then walk around his mindscape for any change that might have been made and repair the damage. It was tedious, to say the least. Tedious and painful. After all, his mindscape was formed in the shape of the Uchiha clan's district. The one from that night, to be exact. Silent, bathed in the light provided by the moon and covered in splashes of blood everywhere. At least his mind hadn't conjured bodies. The only silver lining in the whole place was a single, bright house that was located next to the home he'd grown up in. There, instead of the building that should have been, was Ig and Naruto's house. In the middle of the nightly vision of his mindscape, that one place was bathed in sunlight, making no sense whatsoever. Where everywhere else was dark, in shades of blue and purple, where the moonlight met blood, and silent, that one house was bright, colorful, and he could almost hear the sound of the wind. Where everywhere else he felt the oppressive presence of his past, that house filled him with warmth that he'd become used to and hoped he would have for many years to come. He would almost smile whenever he approached that place. Not now though, not when one of the inhabitants of the house was in a hospital bed without any certainty of being able to wake up. Back to the present, however, he was engaging the part of his mindscape routine that came after repairing damage, trying to fortify his defenses. Which was showing little progress, honestly. There was progress, yes, but it was so slow that it might as well have been nothing. It might take him years to have something that would contain the shade of Orochimaru as Ig had done. The Satter's advice on the matter was less than helpful, but Sasuke guessed that made sense. After all, control of his mindscape came so easily to Ig that he couldn't very well explain how he did what he did. He just thought about getting it done and then he did. You should give up, Orochimaru told him from behind the barrier. You are just wasting your time. Time that you could be using to get stronger. The worst part was that he was right and he, and Sasuke, knew that. His progress was being stunted by the amount of work and effort and time that he had to dedicate to the defenses in his mind. If he weren't doing so, he probably would be much closer to Itachi's and Ige's levels. Instead there he was, struggling to add even a millimeter to the barrier around the cursed mark's disturbance in his mindscape. Regardless, Sasuke would ignore Orochimaru's whispers. There was nothing the fake Sannin could say that would make him give up. The young Uchiha knew the consequences of the snake's plans and he would never facilitate them for him. He'd fight him all the way and remain weak if it meant that he never would have to see one of his friends in a hospital bed like Ig was. It would suck, as Naruto would say, but he'd make do by being weak if that was the case. Sasuke would hate every second of it, but he'd manage. He would ask for help regarding Itachi if it came to that. His revenge wasn't what was important. No, it wasn't important at all. He'd lost everything once already. He wouldn't do so again, he swore. The family he'd managed to build for himself, the friends he'd made. Those were the ones that mattered. What good was revenge if he was alone after it? He'd been alone once, and he refused to be alone again. I could help you. Orochimaru kept his attempts at undermining his resolution. A fool's errand if there ever was one. Sasuke wouldn't falter, of that he had no doubts. The Uchiha imagined the Sannin going silent, pushing whatever he was saying away since he didn't care for what he was saying. Suddenly, fake Orochimaru's speech stopped reaching Sasuke's ears. Instead, the man's mouth opened and closed but no sound came out. Confused, the Sannin looked down, as if trying to see what was wrong. That worked. Sasuke thought to himself, blinking. That was easy. And then and there, he finally felt like he could make progress. Then, he concentrated on something else. Just like before, he took something that he didn't want to deal with anymore, something that wasn't helping him, something that he didn't need. He took that and pushed it away from his mind. In an instant, the blood on the walls and the ground around him disappeared. Sajuke's lips curled up ever so slightly. Oh! Shikamaru Nara. He looked around and he liked what he saw. Most of the group was there, surprisingly. Team 8 and Team 10 were there together with Sakura. Even Hanabi had managed to attend the gathering, surprisingly enough. Hinata was currently chatting with her sister off to the side. Ino was sitting right next to Shikamaru himself, reading through some of her clan scrolls for information regarding mindscapes, to help Naruto and Sasuke with the exercises that were currently keeping the two of them away. That was something that annoyed the Nara slightly, since the only thing the duo had shared regarding that was that it was a secret. That annoyance was, however, much smaller than the worry he felt at the issue. After all, while he was no expert regarding the mind arts, he knew enough from what Ino had shared with him to be aware of the danger the smallest of problems in that field could cause. So, he kept his questions to himself until either the Uzumaki or the Uchiha had it under control. Chaoji, meanwhile, was sitting with Shino and, surprisingly, Kiba. The Akimichi and the Inuzuka were, well, not friends per se, but they were getting closer surprisingly fast. Shikamaru would have been worried for Chaoji if he hadn't been witness to the rather sudden and astonishing change in the Inuzuka's attitude. Despite that, however, Kiba still retained much of what made him Kiba, which was a relief. The last thing they needed was the boy acting just to fit in or for some other less than noble reason. It wouldn't have been well received, to say the least, at any other time but as things were, with the group's mood as down as it was. Shikamaru would have been very displeased if this was just for a prank or something equally as insulting. As for Sakura, she was sitting by herself, actually. Not because she was being excluded or anything of the sort though. The Hirano girl had arrived carrying a bunch of scrolls and books and settled in a corner of the Nara household's backyard to study. Apparently, she'd finally decided which path she wanted to follow, and that was the path of the medical ninja. Shikamaru had been pleased when he'd been told. He liked how well balanced the group was, even if he disliked viewing them in such a battle-focused way. They were ninja, after all, and their lives revolved around battles. Like it or not, everything revolved around fights when it came to them. And that's why I'm studying this, Shikamaru thought as he turned his attention down to the book on his lap. A book about jutsu creation. Next to him laid a small pile with more of those, and on his other side, between Ino and him, rested a bunch of scrolls with information regarding the Nara clan's jutsu. His father hadn't hesitated a second to provide them for Shikamaru, actually. Shikaku had, however, pointed out that what he wanted to make was near impossible, when he'd asked. After all, most Nara techniques involved using their shadows to restrain their opponent in some way. Moreover, they required an absurd amount of chakra to work. Thus, even if he managed to make what he wanted, it'd be a one-time use technique at most, and then it'd leave him out of whatever battle he was in. However, that was perfectly fine for Shikamaru, really. After all, he was trying to create his own technique so that he'd have something to use if he was ever in a situation like the one he'd been in with that woman, Yujito. He'd been next to useless during that fight, so what did it matter if he took himself out with his own technique? If he could make it strong enough to take someone strong with him too, then he'd consider it a win. I suddenly understand why IG looked so awful while preparing for the final test, Shikamaru thought as he continued reading through the scrolls. Jutsu creation was no joke, although he'd known that already. Everything had to be taken into account. Every little piece of chakra the jutsu required had to be accounted for and had to have a detailed path. The smallest of changes could have the energy explode inside the user's body. All hand seals had to flow perfectly with the chakra movements previously mentioned. And that was just to make the technique viable. From there, one had to make the technique actually work, which, if the previous steps were hard, then that part was something else entirely. Either IG is with jutsu creation like Naruto is with seals, or he has been working on this stuff for a long time, Shikamaru thought with a grimace. Okay, enough chatting, Chaoji announced, standing up and dusting his pants. Judging by the grin on Kiba's face, the Inuzuka knew exactly what was coming. Let's spar for a bit. It still took Shikamaru off guard sometimes, how Chaoji could sound eager for a spar when he'd been so shy about that a few years back. Not that it was bad, but it clashed spectacularly with not-so-distant memories that he had of the Akimichi. The boy had certainly come a long way. Would you mind if I train my bug's chakra transfer for a bit? Shino asked, his voice soft and low as usual. The Abiram had, unsurprisingly, taken an interest in that branch of his clan's techniques. He'd even started training specifically with Naruto when the blonde boy was around, since he was the only one that had the red chakra. Those training sessions usually didn't last long and were done sparingly though, since they did a lot of damage to Shino's bugs and whoever the chakra was transferred to. Shokiba nodded, grinning still in place. Taijutsu only then, how about that? He asked Chaoji, who quickly agreed. What do you think? Shikamaru heard Hinata ask and turned to see the Hyuga heiress addressing her sister. Hanabi looked from her sibling towards the boys and back for a moment before nodding. Great, let's spar for a bit ourselves. Will you use the gentle fist? Sakura asked, also looking up from where she was studying. Because if so, I was just reading about a technique to help with chakra points. I'd like to try it out. Shikamaru wondered if that was the first time Sakura had actively looked to join a training session. That sounds all right, Hinata replied with a smile. With a smile, the Nara turned back to his studies. Everyone was still working to get better, it seemed. If anything, they were even more motivated. Was this how you felt all this time, IG? Shikamaru wondered, his mood dropping slightly. Jiraiya. The legendary Sannin felt his eye twitch slightly at the back and forth going on behind him as they traveled. Well, it was more one than the other, really, since one of the people involved mostly replied with one word or even just a grunt. Jiraiya wondered, for a moment, how Naruto managed to convince him to bring his teammate with him. Oh, right, the mindscape thing, he remembered with a slight grimace. The Toad Sage wasn't sure how useful that would be trying to deal with the Kyuubi, really. However, it had done the trick during Orochimaru's invasion, and the last thing they needed was for the fox to turn even more hostile with Naruto if he didn't keep his word. So, he allowed the Uzumaki to spend an hour or so working in his mind. As for the Uchiha that had tagged along, not only was the boy helping Naruto with that part of his training, exchanging ideas and tips, but the boy also needed someone that knew seals in case his cursed seal got out of hand. That had been the reason why Hiruzen had wholeheartedly agreed with the idea of Jiraiya taking Sasuke with them while looking for Tsunade, which had in turn contributed a lot with him accepting that slight change of plans. Still, Jiraiya didn't like being in charge of an immature Jinchuriki and an unstable Uchiha one bit, that much he could tell anyone that cared to listen. Especially if some of the rumors he had been hearing as of late regarding the other Uchiha were true. Nervous as that information made him, he had to admit, albeit reluctantly, that taking both of them out of Konoha was a good idea. The village had received too much damage, and with the trouble that seemed to be brewing between villages, they couldn't afford as much security as they would have liked. Everyone had to be dedicated to getting their feet under themselves. Babysitting 2 people, no matter how high profile they were, had become low priority. Now, if they could be placed under the watchful eye of a Sannin and out of the way though, that was perfect, right? Sometimes Jiraiya hated logic. He almost groaned as Naruto's voice grew louder, arguing something against the other genin. With a sigh, the Sannin decided to distract himself with planning. There was much to do on this trip, after all. First, he wanted to get started and give Naruto some notes regarding the Hiraishin, to see if they sparked something in the boy. Jiraiya was sure that if anyone could completely crack how the technique worked, it would be the young Uzumaki. Not because it was in his blood or anything, but because the boy took to seals like a fish in the water. Fuinjutsu was something that could baffle most people, even those that were considered geniuses and prodigies. One had to have a special kind of mind to understand them, to comprehend how they worked, and even more so to create seals. Naruto had that kind of mind, Jiraiya had quickly confirmed. Second, and this was a new development in his plans, was to train the young Uchiha. He wasn't sure what to train the boy in or what to teach him, but he'd have to do something. If he didn't, he could already see him either demanding some kind of training or, even worse, Naruto doing so. When did I change jobs from spy master to babysitter? Honestly, Jiraiya thought to himself, feeling a headache coming his way. Although Hatake had taught the Uchiha his technique, which had been derived from Minato's. Something to think about, he supposed. He'd have preferred to teach that to Naruto, but the boy seemed disinterested in most things that weren't related to seals. Sometimes he even outright rejected the idea. Really, the blonde had such a one-track mind sometimes. The third thing to plan for was his actual mission, which was predictably the most difficult. Getting Tsunade to come back to Konoha would be a pain, Jiraiya could already tell. There was a reason his former teammate hadn't so much as come close to approaching the village for years. He was already preparing his speech because he knew it would have to be a good one. To Jiraiya, even the scroll with a message from their sensei didn't feel like it would be enough. It was a good thing that they just needed her to come back for the message it would send to everyone else and to have her expertise in medical jutsu. They weren't crazy enough to think that they could get her back on the field. With how things had turned for her, they could respect her decision to stay out of that. Jiraiya blinked, confused. Not because his plans did that to him though. No, it was because of the silence that followed him. Naruto had shut his mouth, which was surprising enough on its own, but his teammate wasn't expressing anything either. That meant that it wasn't just that Naruto was waiting for a response on some question or something. Honestly, if the Toad Sage hadn't been able to hear them walking behind him, he might have been worried about them disappearing. Not that he'd let his guard down that much, but still. A second later, his mind caught up and remembered. After all, this had happened a few times already. He'd only needed to ask one time to be informed of the reason. Ig Sata. The boy that was considered a hero of Konoha, at least by those in the know. There weren't many that were though, surprisingly. Jiraiya's sensei had managed to contain that information remarkably well, which was helped by the fact that most of the Konoha forces had been placed on the outskirts of the village and few had seen what happened around the arena. Jiraiya, however, had one main reason to be thankful towards the boy. He had helped save his sensei's life by giving them the means to penetrate Orochimaru's barrier. It was, amusingly enough, also the main reason for everyone else to be thankful to him, although those tended to broaden it into saying that he was the main reason the invasion had ended as quickly as it had, which wasn't wrong. Getting the information about the invasion in the first place, containing Killer Bee, giving them new ivory to pierce the barrier, snapping B and A from whatever supposed control they had been under. Lots of reasons, really. And thus lots of reasons to be successful in this mission, Jiraiya thought wryly. After all, Tsunade coming back could be the difference between that boy waking up or not from whatever had happened to him during the invasion. Lots of planning to make. Oh. Konoha was falling apart. Buildings crumbled, wood burned and rocks cracked. The ground shook without ever stopping and the trees and posts fell. The unstoppable force proved worthy of such description, pushing through anything and everything that stood remotely close to its path. The only people inside could only do so much while the world around them was destroyed. They did what they could, however, working as if their lives depended on it, which might have been the case. They monitored the beast, they repaired damage where they could, they helped the others. It wasn't enough, however, their efforts slowly but surely leading them nowhere. This isn't working, one finally admitted. I know, another replied, looking grimly at the apocalyptic sight before them. Oh. Anko Mitarashi. She strode forward with a smirk on her face, despite the many angry eyes directed at her. Anko had gotten used to those years ago while in Konoha anyway. These ones might have come from much scarier looking people, but they still didn't affect her at all. She was the one in the winning side anyway, evidenced by all of them being already subdued. Traitor, one of them hissed at her and she laughed. Funny you say that. I was the one that was betrayed first, Anko shot back, grin still in place. What did it matter anyway? It asked mockingly. You were weak. Still are, needing help from outsiders. If you didn't want us to be involved, you never should have messed with our clan, Kumohoshi said. The gigantic black spider stood on top of Manda's bound body. The chief of the spiders had subdued the one from the snake clan with some help from Anko. Besides, you should have seen this coming. Almost every clan has a grudge against you. I bet they'd let me summon them here to take part. Your contractor has done no favors to your already in shambles reputation. At the mention of other clans, Anko saw Manda's body tense up. Interesting that. She wondered who else Orochimaru had managed to piss off in his infinite need to experiment with powers that he was better off leaving alone. It didn't matter in the end, she supposed. Her former sensei would get what was coming to him now. You finally make your appearance, huh? The pale pink spider that had so far simply stood on Anko's shoulder spoke. The Mitarashi was sure that she and the dark blue spider on her other shoulder were something akin to elders of the spiders. Nobody had come out and said as much, but everyone seemed to heed their words without question, even though Kumohoshi was the chief. Besides, everyone called them mother and father, but Anko doubted they were actually everyone's parents, since she knew for sure Shirakumo was Kumohoshi's daughter. It was probably a title of some kind, she supposed. It wasn't the time to think about that though, Anko reminded herself. Especially since a new gigantic snake appeared. This one was completely white, however, with golden bracelet-like accessories put here and there around her body. The snake version of Mother and Father. the Mitarashi guessed. So annoying, the white snake hissed, sounding like someone that had their nap interrupted instead of their territory attacked and their people subdued. Just like the snakes, Anko thought to herself, withholding a sneer. Not a care about anyone but themselves. What are you doing here, Spideys? Just finishing our clan's revenge for the actions of your contractor, the blue spider, father, replied. I see. Are you done, then? The snake asked, looking around disinterestedly, despite all the snakes around being bound by silk and with spiders standing on top of them. However, when she turned towards Anko, the Takubetsu Jounin could see the displeasure there in its slitted eyes, reminding her of the rare times she'd seen the same look on her former sensei. The rage hidden under a facade. The fact that the look was directed at her and not the spiders wasn't lost on her. Anko would be damned if she cowed before it, though. She had done so when it was Orochimaru, and it would always be a mark of shame for her. She would never do so again. Strength, she may lack, but what she did have was pride. We are, mother answered this time, the arachnid nodding along with the statement. Time for us to leave, Anko. Of course, she agreed instantly. She certainly didn't want to be there longer than she had to. She could stand the glare of the snake, but she had no delusions about who would die if something happened. The spiders might have taken out the snakes, but she didn't know how the new addition would affect things. Better to quit while she was ahead. Is this your revenge too, Contractor Mitarashi? The White One questioned, apparently not done with them yet. Anko, meanwhile, froze. It's good to see that you have some of your sensei's mind and viciousness in there. I would have been disappointed if you didn't. Before, Anko would have been greatly insulted by such a statement. Now, however, she knew that someone could be similar to a monster such as Orochimaru and not be anything like him at the same time. It was all in how they used those similarities. Besides, it wasn't like she would be seeing any of them again. She certainly wouldn't be the one to sum. The Snake Clan will work for you, Anko Mitarashi, the White One continued, still staring straight at her, and she froze. Her mind stopped working, unable to process that statement. Elder. Manda started, obviously going to object to such a thing. Silence, the only free snake ordered, and silence was what she got. The Snake Clan recognizes you, Anko Mitarashi. We shall serve you as we did your teacher. All of us, she added, for once turning her glare to someone that wasn't Anko herself and directing it straight at Manda. For a long moment, she stood there, unsure of what to do. Her mind tried to catch up with what the White One said and failed. Why was she saying such a thing? After what she'd done with the spiders? Why? Was it a trap? She is being truthful, Mother told her, sounding confused but not nearly as much as she felt. Maybe the snakes aren't as much of a shame on all animal clans, the elder spider added, sounding like she was talking more to herself than to the Takubetsu Jounin. It's your decision from now. Loath as we are to admit it, the Snake Clan is a formidable one, despite their often questionable choices of contractors, father said, sounding like it pained him to compliment the serpents. It would certainly do the world some good to have them under a decent contractor for once. For a moment, Anko just stood there, taking in what was happening. She had half a mind to just tell the snakes to go fuck themselves. She wanted nothing to do with them. However, that would mean remaining the same, wouldn't it? She would go back and train as she always had. Remain a Takubetsu Jounin, maybe getting to be a proper Jounin in a few years. No, that just wouldn't do. Oh. Can you keep holding it? one of the figures asked from one side. The three of them stood next to each other. The ones on the sides calm and collected, the one in the middle agitated and strained. The one in the middle assured through gritted teeth. His arms extended in front of him, looking as if he was stopping the very world from moving if the effort he was putting was anything to go by. What's the plan now? The one on the other side spoke this time. The three of them stared at the force of nature that had devastated Konoha as it twisted, turned and writhed in its newly formed container. It's a stalemate. There has to be a way, the middle one forced out, sweat running down his face. They don't even know what we are dealing with, one of the figures told him. No reinforcements are coming. I know. Oh. Gaara. Kazekage. They wanted to make him Kazekage. If he weren't indifferent to the whole thing, Gaara would have questioned if they weren't the insane ones instead of himself. Who in their right mind would let him be Kage? Konoha and its allies, apparently. Tumrai had explained to him how it would be in their interests to have him as Kazekage. They would have power over him considering his new friendship with Ig Sata. That, and they probably thought they would be able to easily manipulate him since he was so young. In the end, according to her, it didn't really matter since Suna would be under Konoha's thumb regardless. There was no way they would get away with the invasion. As it was, putting him as Kazekage with strings attached to the leaf was the best deal they could get, Tumrai supposed. Gaara himself was indifferent to the whole thing. If anything, he might have been glad for it, really. It would probably give him an excuse to visit his friend, at least. It was still strange for him to think like that. To know that there was someone out there willing to associate with him. Even his siblings, with whom he was interacting a little more, making an effort to talk to and such, were still afraid of him. Gaara was sure that they wouldn't have stuck around him if not for their blood relations. Sata, on the other hand, had volunteered. Through a deal, yes, but he had done so anyway. Openly and even enthusiastically, unless Gaara had completely misread that. It baffled the Suna ninja, really. Never had he thought he'd experience such a thing. It was nice, he supposed. During his visits to the hospital, that happened in between meetings regarding his promotion and time spent with his siblings, he'd met some of Sata's other friends. They were a mixed bunch, from what he could see, even though he hadn't actually talked to any of them. Seeing them interacting was enough to tell that they were very different from each other. It gave Gaara hope that it wouldn't matter how different he seemed to be to the normal person their age. It was very strange indeed. Some time ago, he wouldn't have cared for such a thing. He would have sneered at the thought that he could need someone else. Much less a friend. It was something that didn't interest him at all. What did he care, really? All he needed was mother and power. Now though, mother's voice was nothing like before. He could tell now. There was something very wrong with it. It filled him with that cold feeling that he'd gotten used to so long ago. It reminded him too much of the nightmares he would have whenever he slept. He wanted nothing to do with that. That couldn't be his mother, he refused to believe so. And as for his power, it had proved to not be enough. There were people out there that could easily destroy him. He wasn't strong enough. He probably never would be. Surprisingly though, he was fine with that. However, now his heart ached whenever he was alone. Gaara yearned for someone to be with him. He needed company, to keep Mother's voice away and to forget how weak he truly was. It was half the reason he was putting so much effort into talking with his siblings, really. It was also the reason he visited Sata often. While he sat there, in that hospital room, he could imagine how it would be if his friend woke up, what they would do then. Would they just talk? Like he was doing with Tamrai and Kankuro now? Would they train, seek to become more powerful together? That seemed like something Sata did with his other friends, from what he'd heard in their conversations. Would they do something else? I'll invite you over for dinner, and everything. Sata's words echoed in his mind. There was that too, he supposed. He wasn't a great fan of, well, eating. It was just something that needed to be done, right? However, now he wondered how different a meal would be when he was accompanied. Meals by himself felt hollow, and meals with his siblings were tense, at the best of times. Would it be different with Sata? While he was doing that, he could forget that he was practically alone in that room, except for the unconscious boy. Even when some of Sata's friends visited, he was essentially by himself. After all, Gaara wasn't their friend. Yet, at least. I'll invite my friends. I think you'll like them, at least some of them. Gaara wondered about that. From what he'd seen, most of Sata's friends were loud, except maybe the boy that had fought Tamrai, Nira, he remembered, Uchiha and Aburam. Would they really like him, as Sata said? Gaara rather doubted that, but if the other boy thought so, maybe he was wrong. Sata had already proved him wrong about what his existence was supposed to be. He supposed it wouldn't be too much of a stretch for him to be right about this too. Gaara wondered how that would be, having a group of friends, people that willingly approached and interacted with him. Gaara! A voice called, breaking him out of his thoughts. Turning his head, he found Tamrai, standing over at his room's door. She looked distinctly uncomfortable, but then again, she always did when she had to speak with him. Kankuro and I were going to take the Leaf Ninja up on their offer to use one of their training grounds. Would you like to come too? She asked. Gaara himself, meanwhile, was surprised. This was the first time his sister had come to him without having to. The two of them could have easily gone without him, after all. For a moment, he stared at her, processing this new development. In the meantime, Tamrai seemed to grow more and more nervous as time passed. Eventually, he replied. Yes. I'd like that, he replied, standing from where he'd been sitting cross-legged on the floor. Was that another change that Sata had brought to his life, to make his siblings be more friendly with him? That couldn't be it though. He'd barely interacted with them, as far as Gaara was aware. He wasn't sure if he'd interacted with them at all, besides indirectly sending a message through the Nira. So, was this a result of Gaara's change? Was this because he'd been more open with his sister and brother? Was it because he'd made an effort to approach them and now they were reciprocating that? If so, then he supposed it was because of Sata, if indirectly so. I guess I'll have to thank him when he wakes up, Gaara thought as he followed Tamrai, together with Kankuro, towards the training grounds. He'd definitely have to thank Sata. Barely any time had passed and his life was already unrecognizable from what it had been before. Oh! Ig Sata laid on his bed, during one of his scarce moments of solitude in his stay at the hospital. Where there were usually a few friends visiting, now there were only empty chairs. As if reflecting that, the light of the sun was slowly but surely leaving place to the darkness of the night. The wind receded and the curtains barely moved with the lightest of breezes. That's what he woke up to. He stirred weakly, a whisper of a groan leaving his mouth. His body was in excruciating pain, but that was to be expected. His chakra coils felt like they had fire coursing through them instead of energy. His right eye was particularly damaged, he could tell. It was covered in bandages that did nothing to assuage the tender skin, and the smallest of twitches sent waves of pain through him. Still, he was awake now, which was much better than how things had been a moment before. He took a shaky breath in, trying to gather himself despite the weak state of his body and how torturous just being awake was. He pulled his mind together as best he could, having been through worse in his life than pain. There was a lot to do, and the more time he wasted, the more things could change for the worse. He needed help, and to get it he needed to act. Every second counted. He stirred once more, determined to, this time, actually do something. And like that, IG sat as eye finally opened. Only, it wasn't red, no. It was a golden eye with a slitted pupil. One of a pair of eyes that were infamous through the elemental nations. Hiruzen Sarutabi. What have you done with IG, Orochimaru? He asked, his tone holding none of its usual calm and collected nature. No, after all that had happened to his precious village and to the people in it, after all that was still happening around them, this was the last thing he wanted to deal with. He'd wished it wasn't true, that his Anbu had been wrong somehow. But they weren't. When he had been told that IG had woken up, he'd been elated. That joy died a quick death when the guard that he'd placed in the boy's room had added that he had Orochimaru's eye instead of his. That had brought up fears that he'd buried deep inside himself since the day IG had been marked. Now, Hiruzen had to sit there, watching the boy he'd trusted with his surrogate grandson lie on a bed, like he'd done for days already. He'd been forced to know that he was there, more scarred than some veterans already so soon in his career, for mistakes he'd made. Knowing that both major scars of his were because of Hiruzen's own oversights, both because of his former student, to add salt to the wound. Furthermore, he now had to face IG, the boy he'd regularly visited, conversed and played with. Hiruzen had to look him in the face and see his only visible eye being Orochimaru's. The Hokage had many failures in his past already, but it never got any easier to be confronted with one. IG needs help, Sarutabi. Of all the things Hiruzen expected Orochimaru to tell him, that wasn't one of them. He was especially surprised that he'd been addressed as Sarutabi as opposed to the now usual mocking sensei that his former student loved to insult him with. Shocked as he was with that though, it made him frown. Was that a trick or something else? I'm not Orochimaru, or his shade, whoever was possessing IG said. Hiruzen was pretty sure that this was his student though. It even sounded like him, which made for a terrible cover. That could be intentional though. I'm Hakai, a construct that IG based on the shade of Orochimaru left by the mark. I was supposed to keep an eye on his mindscape and the shade itself. Hiruzen blinked at that and turned to Inoichi, who had come for the interrogation, same as Ibuki. How did he do it? Inoichi asked, clearly looking out of his depth. It would have been a telltale of a plot, if not for IG's knack for doing things that nobody else could. He willed a copy of the shade and then placed as many safeguards on me as he could think of. He regularly goes over them and corrects or adds to them too, the being answered calmly. It was eerie, really, to hear IG's voice but knowing it wasn't him. I'm incapable of going against IG, not that I would anyway. Shade and I are entirely too afraid of him to do anything. Forgive me if that sounds hard to believe, Hiruzen replied with a scowl. It wouldn't, if you had seen what we have. Ask the Yamanaka, although I'm sure he's reported to you the special kind of hell that awaits me or Shade should we try anything. The thing shot back instantly, clearly unimpressed with his distrust. The reference to the void as everyone that knew of it seemed to call it, made Hiruzen pause. It was true that he wasn't as impressed with it as everyone that had witnessed it seemed to be. However, after seeing its effects on Kabuto Yakushi, he could very well believe that it was something worthy of respect, at the very least. He chanced another look towards both of his advisors on the matter, who kept their eyes firmly on Iji's body. Inoichi gave a nod almost immediately. Ibuki soon followed, slower and much more reluctantly. At that, Hiruzen took a deep breath in. It sounds like you've been around for a while. Why didn't we know of you? Hiruzen asked. Because Ig has secrets, just like everyone else, Hakai replied, for once seeming to put his guard up. If Hiruzen and several others hadn't put Ig through background check after background check and scrutinized his life as they had, maybe he'd have suspected that the boy was a spy. He might trust the boy, but Konoha always had to come first. However, if that wasn't the case, then what did the boy want to hide from them? Or, maybe, it was just him trying to get some privacy when they'd had someone regularly entering his mind. Hiruzen couldn't even blame him that much if that was the case. He knew grown adult ninja that would have reacted much the same. That wasn't the issue at hand now though, so he pushed that aside for the moment. So, you said Ig needs help? Hiruzen asked. Regardless of his wariness, this was one of his genin's life that was on the line. It was also someone he cared about and someone Naruto cared about. He could afford to see if this was truly as Hakai said. That didn't mean that he wouldn't have Anbu guards around him again. This time, for a completely different reason. Yes, the three of us have several theories, Hakai started. Hiruzen was suddenly struck by the fact that he was including the shade of Orochimaru in that. Or, maybe, it was another construct like himself. But, he did say that the shade was too afraid to. The Hokage noted. The most likely, we think, is that the Hakai Chakra, the cursed seal and the changes Ig made to the mark's effects, had an unexpected, very unpleasant consequence. What consequence would that be? Hiruzen asked, his eyes narrowed. We believe Hakai started answering, looking very unsure of what he was saying all of a sudden. That it might have created a chakra beast. Oh. Ig Sata. You think they'll find a way? I don't know, Ig replied with a grimace. His eyes were fixated on what could only be considered an eldritch abomination. The creature he was currently trying to contain in a mind-made force field didn't have any distinctive features, really. Its body changed shapes all the time, from what they had been able to see. Sometimes, it would sprout tentacles, sometimes legs, sometimes arms with hands, sometimes it would be pincers and so on. Sometimes it wouldn't even have limbs, turning into an amalgamation of flesh, or bone, or shell, or all of the above at the same time. It didn't even seem to be able to decide which color it was supposed to be, to the point that, on occasions, Ig wouldn't even be able to tell which it was or if it was even a real color in the first place. It was an unnerving sight, to be sure, but the worst part was the sounds it made. Gurgles, wails, chirps, cackles, roars and all manner of sonic-based manifestations that shouldn't even come from a living being, or anything at all, really. The worst part was that Ig couldn't ignore either its looks or its sounds, since he couldn't risk missing something from such a being. The last thing he needed was for it to surprise him in any way. I sure hope they do though, Ig muttered to himself, eyeing the twisting form of what they considered to be a new chakra beast. How the fuck did this happen? I remember something about the Hakai bee being able to reform from a piece, but this isn't a Hakai bee clone, damn it. I didn't even try to absorb this. Was it because of proximity alone? Did the curse mark really screw me over in the end? It would have been almost funny, if that was the case. After all, just when he thought he had Orochimaru's stupid seal under control, it found a way to mess everything up for him. The snake contractor wouldn't let him have any peace, it seemed. Even when he wasn't around or even doing anything. So do I, Shade agreed with a nod, and IG glanced towards him out of the corner of his eyes. I wonder about that, the boy thought but didn't say. He'd made a desperate decision when he'd woken up in his mindscape while it was being decimated by the beast. He'd called on Hakai to help, even if it was just keeping an eye on things and reporting damages. Then, when it became obvious that even that wasn't enough, he'd let out Shade and hoped Mark's manifestation wouldn't screw him over. He'd been that desperate. So far though, Shade hadn't done anything that guaranteed sending him to the White Room or the Void. That I know of, IG corrected himself, focusing back on the beast. Still though, he could try and see if he was being screwed over later when he didn't have a Lovecraftian entity rampaging in his mind. It's preparing again, Shade warned him, and IG cursed under his breath. Indeed, the creature was curling up, its mass pulling into itself until it was only half the size it had been. He'd made the mistake, back when it first happened, to think that it was losing power, that he was winning this weird battle of sorts. He'd been wrong. It was a theory that was proven wrong again and again, just like in that moment, as the creature unleashed all its power in one move. IG's defenses broke, shattered like thin glass, and the rampage started once more. The boy staggered back for a moment, feeling like he'd just taken a sledgehammer to the skull, before stumbling forward and trying to get his defenses up. It was why he could only try to contain it. He'd never be able to do that, if his experiences so far were anything to go by. They are happening more often, Shade unnecessarily pointed out. IG really wanted to snap something at him, but he had to focus on the beast. It wasn't like the Mark's manifestation was wrong either. It was just something that was worrying the Satyr more and more as time passed. What was worse was that IG only had one way to try and fight back a little harder. Give Shade power in the mindscape. A risky move, to say the least, but he was feeling the effects of the beast's damage in his mindscape. He was feeling sluggish, he reacted slower, he forgot things more often, and he struggled to remember even more. He just couldn't repair damage as fast as the beast destroyed, and if it continued throwing its overpowered tantrums more and more, then his chances of even keeping his mind were slim. He needed an edge, and Shade could be that. The problem was that IG didn't trust him. At all. He'd have to risk it though, just as he'd risked it sending Hakai out to look for help and inform the outside of what was going on in his mindscape. Even more frustrating than not having any idea of how that was going was that he didn't even know how the invasion had ended. He wasn't even sure what was going on while he was awake back then. When he'd been unable to maintain wit's end on Killer Bee, even with the increased regeneration that he'd gotten, the man had made quick work of both Gaara and IG himself. A moment later, the Kumo Jinchuriki had demanded he put the Raikage, his brother, in the same genjutsu. Why, IG had absolutely no idea, but he'd done so, because why wouldn't he? It couldn't make the situation worse. Also, he'd hoped, at least. He'd used Mortal Reminder on the Kumo leader though, because he knew he was too weak to maintain the advanced form for any duration really. He hoped it would be enough, just before he passed out. Next thing he knew, he was dealing with an aberration inside his own mind. I just can't catch a break, can I? He thought as he managed to imprison the creature once more. This might take a while, he heard in his head. Hakai? IG asked back, concentrating as much as he could considering the circumstances. They'd never spoken like that, but he didn't have it in him to question that. Yes. This might take a while, IG his creation told him, and he grimaced. So, last resort. I'm afraid so, Hakai answered, and IG could almost see a grimace on his face. If it's any consolation, I don't think he'll backstab us. Shade the satyr called out, breathing deeply to calm his nerves. Yes. You are helping me with this, IG told him, concentrating on the permissions he was giving Shade. He lamented the fact that he couldn't place restrictions or make changes to him like he'd done with Hakai. If I so much as suspect that you'll betray me, I'll throw you in the void, even if this thing turns me into a vegetable, he warned, because no way he was just leaving it at that. Understandable, but I won't, Shade nodded, as if he'd been expecting that, which might have been the case. And please, could you call me something other than Shade? He asked, making IG blink, bemused by the request. Like what? The boy shot back, because he had no time to think of a name, of all things. That, and he was sure that Shade had something in mind already. Kij was the response he got, and he almost laughed. It was basically the same shit, wasn't it? Except that this one was more pretentious. Fine then, Kij, let's see if we can keep this thing under control between the two of us. Yes, let's, the formerly named Shade agreed easily, turning a determined gaze towards the beast. Oh. Orochimaru. How had this happened? Looking around at his almost empty cell, he could only wonder about that, the whole time he was in his cell. All his plans had been perfect, just a few months before the exams. Then, the Leaf had decided to get involved in the Mist's war, and that had thrown all his plans out the window really quick. At first, Orochimaru had thought little of it. The bloody mist could hardly be considered an inconvenience of any kind, too weakened by fighting itself for so long. What did it matter if Konoha got them to form an alliance after helping them? However, that little change had brought Kumo and Iwa to the Chunin exams, and that wasn't good for this scheme. Orochimaru still thought his plans were salvageable though. Especially after the Cloud had decided to join his side. There was no lost love between the Sannin and them, but there was even less between Kumo and Konoha. And after offering to let them kidnap a few bloodline carriers, they'd been set. As for Iwa, it was supposed to be easy. A little manipulation here and there had seen Onaki's daughter crossing paths with the Ichibi Jinchuriki, and everyone knew that wouldn't end well for anyone. Except, the girl hadn't died. None of them had died. That was fine though. Kumo had thrown its matches in the preliminaries, as they had agreed. Yuji Tonii, infiltrated as one of the members of the Kumo team, even gave up before the fights began, taking off to do what she did best. Sabotage. And sabotage she did. Exploding tags were spread over almost all of Konoha. Everything was going perfectly according to plan, or as perfect as it could. Then, another problem surged. Kabuto was captured. Orochimaru had been confident though, that his spy wouldn't reveal anything. Except, he did. The Sannin realized that as soon as the exams got delayed, or, at least, that's when he started suspecting that Kabuto had given in, for whatever reason. That was fine too though, the situation was still salvageable. There were many things that the Yakushi didn't know. So, he'd expanded on his already altered plans. Used the time he was given to do a few more things, like calling for some reinforcements and gathering Rosa's body to use the impure world reincarnation on him too. There was no way that the other 3 kids would stand a chance. It simply couldn't be done. Defeating the resurrected leaders was impossible without him consciously giving up, and that would never happen. However, once more, his plans failed. His barrier fell and Killer Bee turned on them, closely followed by himself. How had that happened? Orochimaru had no clue, but he refused to believe it was something that Ig Sata had done. There was no way a genin, even one that had caught the eye of the Snake Sun in himself, would have such a jutsu. Was there? That's what Orochimaru had been wondering ever since. Most of the things that had gone wrong could be attributed to him. Many of those only through speculation, but still. Once, could be coincidence, but more than that, and it guaranteed suspicion. The mist was out. Ig didn't have that much of an influence, least of all back then. And that also took out the presence of Kumo and Iwa. However, young Kurotsuchi's survival was definitely his fault, that much Orochimaru had confirmed. Kabuto's capture could be his doing too, but that was only a maybe, only because he'd been the one to interact with the Yakushi the most. He could even be involved in his spy's surrendering of information. After all, if he could turn Killer Bee, and of all people, who was to say that he couldn't do the same with Kabuto? And that also brought the last point to the way he had made Orochimaru's allies turn against him. Possible vessel or not, Ig Sata had made an enemy of Orochimaru. For that alone, he would pay dearly. He blinked when the metal door of his cell opened. Surely they didn't expect more interrogation/torture to work. Little Anko had tried, poor girl, but only got laughed at. Same as everyone else. Pitiful attempts, really. How had Kabuto broken under these people? The boy might not have been as good as Orochimaru himself, but surely he could endure this much, right? Even the Yamanaka weren't all that for a mind that had been trained against them specifically. So, the Sannin's thought process was interrupted as something unexpected happened. Through the door came a bunch of people, instead of the usual only interrogator. That alone wasn't too surprising though. No, the shock came from the one that was being pushed in on a wheelchair. Well, don't look so well, do you, Ig-kun? He mocked with a nasty grin that by itself irked more than one person. He personally found it highly amusing that a smile could set people off. Most of them could be so very stupid, honestly. The assessment was true though. Not only did he have to be pushed around, but the carrier of one of his cursed seals had bandages all over his body, the most notorious patch covering his right eye. Even more so, the boy was slumped against the wheelchair as if even sitting required too much effort from him, and the paleness of his skin certainly pointed that way too. He didn't even have his eyes open. Orochimaru almost thought he was sleeping. The boy hummed. At least I'm not in a cage like a rat, am I? Ig shot back at him, finally opening his eye and taking the Sannin off guard. That was his eye. For a split second, Orochimaru almost thought that his seal had taken over the boy. However, that couldn't be it. Konoha wouldn't let something like that happen, and least of all take that person to his cell. The Sannin's eyes moved towards Morino, who stationed himself on one side of the door after leaving Ig sitting in front of the prisoner. On the other side of the door stood the Yamanaka clan head. Is this some kind of trick? Orochimaru asked with a raised eyebrow, unimpressed. I wish, Ig replied lazily. Unfortunately, it isn't. So, I'll need you to tell me everything you know about the cursed seal. And I'll just tell you, right? Orochimaru mocked with a chuckle. I'm very disappointed, Ig-kun. I thought you would be better at interrogation after being taught by my student. I'm not IG and I'm also much better at getting information than you think. After all, Kabuto sang like a bird, did you know? So it had been IG's doing. Why did he say he wasn't himself when it was so utterly obvious though? You can call me Hakai, that's the name I was given and I like it. Sure thing, Hakai-kun, Orochimaru replied with a patronizing smile. So, I assume you aren't going to comply with us the easy way, huh? The boy looked almost bored with that realization. A shame really. After spending so much time and effort trying to escape death, you just give up like that. I'm very disappointed, Orochimaru, he added, giving him a grin that he knew very well. His smile, the same one he'd just put on for IG. Or what he thought was IG. This couldn't be him though. Those eyes, that expression, those words. How could he possibly know what his goal was? Nobody knew that he had been trying to find immortality all that time. Everyone thought he just wanted power, jutsu and nothing else. So, how are you, me? No. I'm not you. Never you. I'm pretty close though. After all, I'm a product of you putting the cursed seal on IG, the thing answered, his grin growing wider. So, thanks for that, even if my existence wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. I created you and you just turn against me. The Sannin accused through narrowed eyes. You didn't create me, the being, Hakai denied instantly. IG did. What you created was shade. Though let me tell you, I have it on good authority that he'd turn against you too. He's not too happy that you left him at IG's mercy. Orochimaru blinked, for once not understanding anything of what someone was telling him. What did this Hakai mean with that? For that matter, what was this thing even trying to tell him? What point was he trying to make? Anyway, we've chatted long enough. I feel tired and I really can't be bothered with more of this. Let's stop beating around the bush, Hakai mused, almost as if he was talking to himself. Then, slowly, almost as if it required a huge effort on his part, his hands rose and started going through hand seals. It's cute that you think any jutsu you have will make me talk, Orochimaru told him, more curious than afraid. What could he have done to break Kabuto? Now the Sannin wanted to know. That is, until the technique was applied. Is this what death is like? Is that what he was talking about? Those questions plagued Orochimaru's mind as he floated senselessly in nothing. He'd meditated before, in his attempts to harness senjutsu. It was actually a lot about letting go of one's senses and focusing on the energy around one. Thus, Orochimaru thought he had a pretty good idea about how not feeling anything would feel like. He had no idea what it would feel like. What the genjutsu, as he had quickly found out, did much worse than whatever he may have experienced before. First, because it was forceful. Meditation was a conscious action. This, however, was someone else taking away his senses from him in a single moment. And second, as a conscious action, meditation could be stopped pretty much at any moment. This, however, he couldn't break out of. It was the most horrifying thing, really. Genjutsu was supposed to be breakable, especially those not coming from a Sharingan user. But there Orochimaru was, unable to dissipate it. Unable to escape the hell that demon had put him in. Is this what death is like? His mind repeated, sounding distant, muddled. Was it his mind at all? Was there even a voice to begin with? There was nothing, after all. So, in the end, I failed. And he had Death had touched him in the end. He looked on, from the side, as Hakai placed Orochimaru under Iji's genjutsu. God, the whole situation was a very confusing mess. However, Ibuki had long since gotten used to being a little crazy here and there. This was more than a little over that, but he could push through that and continue operating as normal. Or as normal as could be, given the circumstances. It was that mindset that allowed him to process what he was seeing when Hakai let go of the jutsu, looking worse than before, which was saying something. After all, Iji Sato hadn't been in good health before, suffering from tailed beast chakra poisoning. Ibuki didn't want to know how it felt for someone like that to cast a jutsu of any kind, let alone one such as the one Sato had created. Back to the point, Ibuki was taken aback by the reaction of Orochimaru to the genjutsu. He'd gotten progressively more agitated as time passed, twisting and turning on his seat, janking his arms and legs around in an effort to break out of whatever he was experimenting at the moment, either that or trying to damage himself with the cuffs to break the technique. It didn't work. The Sannin shouted and screamed, as he continued his vain attempts at escaping. It was a sight that nobody had ever thought possible, Ibuki was sure. Many had dreamed of hunting Orochimaru, making him pay for his crimes, be them against the village or against themselves if they had been victims of the man. However, none ever actually thought it would happen, that much he knew. And then the Sannin was snapped out of the technique. The man breathed erratically, deeply, as if that sole action held some unknown, precious value to him suddenly. His eyes were wide and his face so pale that it almost looked like Ibuki would be able to see through him. For a moment, the shinobi that people in all nations feared for years sputtered incoherently before finally starting to string words together. What? What did you do? Showed you what waits for you on the other side, Orochimaru Hakai replied, with a smile not unlike the one the Sannin always wore. Death. The afterlife. Or, as we call it, the void. Ibuki didn't know what was more unsettling, the message itself, the fact that Hakai delivered it as if he really believed what he was saying, or the fact that Orochimaru seemed to believe him. The T&I commanding officer had been there when Iji Sato had interrogated Kabuto Yakushi, and it had been a surprise when the spy broke. Everyone had been shocked that a mere kid could just make someone like that talk. Ibuki would have tried to get the kid to join his division if not for the fact that the boy was clearly made for more than just interrogation and espionage. Sato would go places and everyone knew it. Especially Ibuki though, since he was privy to the boy's side education, as it were. He was hoping it wouldn't turn him into the monster he could certainly become. How did you even make such a thing? Orochimaru asked, his expression disturbed and horrified. Which said a lot about the situation, considering the inhuman things the Sannin had done through his life. Or perhaps it was just the fact that it had been used against him. Maybe even both. I didn't make anything, Hakai answered, looking positively amused. Iji did. It's truly a terrifying technique, is it not? Shade and I got to experience it too, which is why we aren't going to betray Iji. I'm not that crazy even if I'm based on you, indirectly. That brought the question to Ibuki's mind. How did Sato come up with it, when even Orochimaru seemed to think it was insane? It made Ibuki wonder, yet again, how bad the technique really was. He'd been told, of course. Sato had explained the technique to everyone before using it on Kabuto Yakushi. Inoichi had detailed it for them too, based on his experiences inside the boy's mindscape, although the Yamanaka had admitted the one he'd seen was a watered-down version since he wasn't the actual target of it. Ibuki had even picked up some information from Yakushi's babbling after the fact. Evidently, he hadn't come even close to knowing what the technique could really be like. What kind of technique did that kid make? Now Hakai spoke again after a long silence. You'll tell me about the cursed seal. Never. Orochimaru refused yet again, which was, sadly, the unsurprising part. I made it to escape precisely what you showed me. I won't let you ruin it. I see. Hakai mused, looking unaffected by that reply. It was as if he didn't care at all about getting that information, even if it was key for Ig Sata's recovery, apparently. If Ibuki didn't already have huge doubts about the loyalty of the thing, he would have started having some with just that. You see, that won't save you, at all. That was your only trick, wasn't it? Orochimaru asked, looking both victorious and hopeful. That last part almost made Ibuki doubly take. That was a day full of surprises, apparently. You have nothing to threaten me with now. Not quite. Hakai shot back instantly with a grin that made Ibuki feel uneasy. You see, we can see about getting a seal drawn based on the genjutsu. Put you permanently in it. So, even if we can't kill you, even if you can't die, you'll still be dead. The grin widened. Orochimaru reeled back. Of all the impossible things that had come to happen through the day, Ibuki was sure there was none like the absolutely terrified expression that the Sannin shot Hakai. Oh! Hiruzen Sarutobi. We need both Jiraiya and Tsunade for this, he heard Danzo admit, which must have hurt. His old friend hated acknowledging the fact that Konoha couldn't do something on its own, and he also disliked how Hiruzen had let his students basically abandon the village. Thus, it must have pained him to say such a thing. Indeed, Hiruzen agreed easily as he looked over the information Orochimaru had given them about the cursed seal. His mind was only half focusing on that though, the other half remembered what he'd seen from the other side of the one-way glass of the interrogation room. He wondered if he'd ever get used to Ig, or Hakai in this case, using that technique on someone. Each use he witnessed made it more and more clear why the boy refused to share it with anyone or even use it himself. It seemed to be an aberration on par with the impure world reincarnation. If the boy ever decided to share it, that technique would go straight into Kinjutsu list. Anything that could do that to Orochimaru of all people deserved nothing less. Or anything that could make Danzo look that pleased for that matter. Friends, they might be, but he'd never understand the Shimura's liking for brutal techniques and methods. This particular case highlighted why Danzo liked Ig as much as he did. After all, from the whole batch of genin he'd come from, and probably in the last few years too, the Sata was the only one that could come up with such a thing. He was usually a rather amiable boy, but when he felt like he needed to, he could come up with terrifying things. Danzo was no doubt eager to bring that side of Ig out much more often, and Hiruzen wasn't sure if that was a good or a bad thing. It would no doubt instill the fear of God on anyone that opposed Konoha, but it was equally as likely to destroy the boy's life too. That was something that the Hokage didn't like, at all. Hiruzen Danzo spoke, breaking the silence and bringing the Hokage out from his musings. We can't keep Iwa and Kiri Ninja in our village for much longer, he told him, and Hiruzen sighed. It wasn't that he'd actively decided to have them stay in Konoha, really, but he'd also done nothing to make them go. With all that was happening, between the invasion and the attacks on the other villages Jinchuriki, they'd just stayed together, almost waiting for something else to go wrong. Hiruzen also had the strong suspicion that the other two Kids had prolonged their visit for the same reason he'd delayed having to send them off. hopes for an alliance. An official one, in the Mist's case, and if they could add the stone to it, all the better for them. Kiri was so weak after their civil war that they needed to be in as many of the other villages' good graces as they could. Otherwise, a war of any kind could very well mean the destruction of their village. The stone, on the other hand, wasn't eager for an alliance. Hiruzen knew that much. Onaki, however, was, because the old Kij had experienced just as much as the Sarutobi had, if not more. If anyone wanted to avoid another war, it was him. The problem was that the Sushikage didn't have the backing of his village in this particular matter. Granted, he could probably garner some support for an alliance with other villages, even Konoha, but it wouldn't be nearly enough. Sadly, there was too much hatred and bitterness in Iwa after the last war and how it had ended. It would take something drastic for the stone to change its standing. Hiruzen could only grimace as he tried to foresee how things would go from then on. Konoha had been attacked, Kiri was weakened and with one less Jinchuriki, same for Iwa that was still filled with negativity from old losers. Suna was still half dead after years losing business and now having to deal with the aftermath of their actions, and, finally, Kumo had also participated in the aforementioned attack and now would be under the scrutiny of 3 of the 5 major villages. On top of all that, now there seemed to be another side, an unknown one, seemingly working against them, all of them. Hiruzen sighed. Yes, we'll have to send them off soon, the Hokage nodded. A common enemy might bring what you so desperately want, old friend Danza told him. It was a silver lining, at least, Hiruzen supposed. He wasn't sure if it was good enough to make up for all that could end up happening in the future, but if it brought peace, he hoped it would at least bring peace. Otherwise, he wasn't sure how he would take it if it only led to more losses on all sides. Everything will either get much better or much worse in the future, Danza mused, looking out the window at the village. Hiruzen, much as he didn't want to, found himself agreeing. He supposed he shouldn't be surprised really. Even in the years of peace, they hadn't been able to rest. Peace seemed more and more like an illusion as time passed. Hiruzen hated thinking that, but after 3 world shinobi wars and years of peace with one problem after another and one battle after another, the world they lived in seemed to be cursed to eternal conflict. It made it hard for Hiruzen to think that this situation that seemed to be coming their way could lead to anything remotely good. We can't give up though, Hiruzen thought, closing his eyes and focusing on what mattered. The young ones, Konohamaru, Naruto, Ig and all the other children. He worked to make a better world for them. That was his way and he would die before he left them with a world so full of death and battles. Let's increase the chances of it getting better. Oh. Ig Sata. It's getting calmer, Shikage said, and Ig could only nod. The boy wasn't sure if he was relieved or worried about this change in the beast's behavior. Was it tiring out, or was it preparing for an even more dangerous tantrum? Regardless, bringing Kij into the fold had helped, much as he didn't want to admit it. Ig was sure he wouldn't have lasted, let alone managed to successfully contain the thing without the Shade's help. Guess he's a little more trustworthy than I thought he would be, he mused. Which didn't mean he would lower his guard. Ig was still checking his mindscape, something that he could do thanks to Kij, ironically enough. He had to make sure that nothing was being done by the Shard of Orochimaru. He didn't think he would do anything, but he also didn't think it would be wise to just trust him. Back to the matter at hand though, the beast was slowing down on its rampage. Now, it mostly just twisted and turned in place, letting out more whimpers than anything else. IG had also noted that even its shape-shifting was, well, not stopping, but it was happening less and less quickly. Seems like it's deciding in a permanent form, the boy noted, at least it seemed to be doing so, slowly. It now sported 8 limbs more often than not, be it hands, or legs, or paws, or anything else. The number had become almost a constant at that point. Hakibi's influence through its chakra. Shame I don't remember much about how the Baijua came to be. It could be useful knowledge here. IG thought, biting his lip. Still, he had other things to focus on, like repairing his badly damaged mindscape. The recreation Konoha he'd made was slowly being reconstructed as time passed. He was putting even more effort than before, trying to make it more resistant, just in case. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but he'd take no chances. As he went about that, his thoughts were pulled towards the beast again and again. He didn't know why, but his mind focused on it more often than not. IG was almost sure that the thing was influencing him, but that didn't make much sense. The thing was no longer affecting his mindscape, and this compulsion seemed unaffected by his reparations. Still, a chakra beast, if I'm right, then that would be really useful in the future. He thought to himself. IG had often worried, after all, that he'd find himself lacking in the power department when he reached the late game. Powerful as his system made him, he didn't know how well he would stand, even with a time skip and all, against the likes of Madara, Kaguya, or even just Pain. Naruto had the Kyuubi, Sasuke had the Sharingan, both were basically demigods, apparently. Everyone else was just next to useless, really. And that could very well include IG himself. He didn't want that, obviously. Thus, why he thought the chakra beast forming could be a good thing. Granted, he didn't even know if that was what was going on in his mindscape. It could very well be something, anything, else, for all he knew. He had a good feeling that he was right though. I see things are going better than expected on this side, he heard Orochimaru's voice say. IG knew who that was though. Hakai, how did things go in the world of the living? The boy asked, trying to sound casual about it. He couldn't hide how worried he was though, least of all in his own mind. Everything seems to be all right. Sarutobi says that all of your friends are all right. You seem to be the one most affected by the invasion, which apparently ended soon after you passed out. I wasn't told much more, I'm afraid, his creation replied, and IG sighed in relief. That was good, very good. I interrogated Orochimaru with wits end too, he added, and IG tensed up. Giving Hakai the knowledge of the jutsu hadn't been something he was keen on doing, but the satyr had given orders, and suggestions, to not use it on anyone that wasn't approved by IG himself. Orochimaru happened to be in that short, very short list. So, I hope you got something useful, the boy commented, not even having to ask if it had worked. He'd be very surprised if there was even one being that could withstand the void in the world of Naruto. Except maybe the Shinigami, but he'd long since stopped thinking about that for the headache it was sure to induce. I got information on the cursed seal. I'm very sure he managed to hide some stuff, but nothing that I cared about at the moment, Hakai informed. IG wondered what could have been hidden. Probably the location of some cursed seals. They were Orochimaru's Horcruxes, after all. It wouldn't do for him to reveal his soul pieces or whatever. That wasn't something IG cared about at the moment. Hiruzen seems to think that help will come soon. Help, huh? IG mused. What help could it be? Jiraiya was supposed to be in the village, so the seal part should be taken care of. What else was there to Tsunade? The satyr realized. Around this time was when the Toad Sanin had gone after the woman with Naruto to get her to be Hokage. Hiruzen was alive though, so they sent for her just to heal me. It was a possibility, he supposed. He'd earned at least some favor from Danza, he was sure, even if he wasn't sure the extent of it. Hiruzen liked him well enough to, he guessed. He wasn't on Naruto's level on that front, but he was high enough, maybe. Then again, maybe there are other reasons for that call. It would be kind of presumptuous to think it's just for me, Ig thought to himself. On this side, well. The boy looked at the beast and at Kage. I enlisted Kage's assistance. Things were getting out of hand really fast over here, he explained, putting emphasis on the shard's new name, which Hakai seemed to pick up on instantly but didn't question. I see, his creation nodded slowly. I'm sure he won't try anything. He's too afraid of the void. Ig nodded along with that, picking up on what wasn't being said. Meaning that you won't for the same reason, huh? He mused. After all, Hakai was a copy of Kage. Slightly modified, but a copy nonetheless, and thus, he shared the shade of Orochimaru's experience in the void. Guess I can trust them a little more then. Can you help Kage contain the beast? I want to finish repairing the mindscape as quickly as possible, Ig asked, forcing out the words. Knowing that he could trust them was one thing, actually trusting them was another altogether. Let alone that he wasn't 100% sure that he could trust them. There would always be that one little part of him that wouldn't, because of who they were. Ig didn't see that as a bad thing though. Once he gave Hakai the power to work on his mindscape, same as he had with Kage, the boy started more thoroughly working on his mindscape. He felt entirely too vulnerable with it in shambles as it was. It was horrifying, feeling like his own mind wasn't what it should be, didn't work as it should. He barely felt like himself anymore and he hated it. Walls were strengthened, glasses were reformed, craters were filled, rubble was cleaned, everything went back where it should be. He worked to make everything even better than before. He added more details, he made things stronger, added more support to everything. He wanted his mindscape to survive a beast on the loose and he'd goddamn make it so. The beast, everything came back to the beast once more. Ig really needed to decide what was up with that and what he wanted to do about it. He couldn't very well continue to contain it as he was. He'd never be able to leave the mindscape for long like this. He couldn't leave Kage and Hakai alone with power over his mind, not for extended periods of time, at least. That meant he had two choices: wait until someone on the outside found a way to solve his problem or try to solve it himself. Once he was done, he went back to Hakai and Kage. Ig looked over the field where the beast continued to fight, albeit weaker than before. Was there anything he could do in the first place? What could he do about such a thing, when he could barely contain it by himself? Still, he had to do something. He walked up to the barrier. Ig. A voice called from the side, and the boy was surprised to note that it was Kage. Maybe he really had changed, at least a bit. Stranger things had happened, he supposed. He would know. Ig ignored them though, taking step after step. Soon enough, he reached the invisible wall that contained the beast, which continued to twitch and twist on the ground. At least it wasn't thrashing around causing mini earthquakes. He continued walking until he was past the shield. Ig. This time it was Hakai who called, but he was ignored too. the boy's mind focused on shielding himself in case this backfired. He was doing something crazy, but he wasn't absolutely insane. He didn't think so, at least. He was pretty sure he could tank one of the beast's hits if he focused his mind solely on protecting himself from that. The thing might be strong, but this was still his mindscape. The beast stopped moving, apparently sensing his approach. How, IG didn't know. After all, it didn't have any eyes at the moment, nor ears or nose or whatever else it could use to be aware of its surroundings. Regardless, the thing stood still, and the boy almost felt like it was staring at him. Nothing more dangerous than a trapped animal, he reminded himself even as he steeled his resolve. He kept on walking until he was almost touching the gigantic creature. It had pulled itself up on its 8 limbs, and drawn back against the barrier like a spider. He would know. IG liked to think he knew one thing or two about arachnids. The fact that the beast that had basically destroyed his whole mindscape was acting like a scared insect was both amusing and bemusing. IG could hear the two people behind him calling and warning him, but he ignored them. He needed to do something. God knew what could be happening outside now that Cannon was officially out the window. Events could be hastened, worsened, or both. He couldn't just be doing nothing in his mindscape while the world went to shit. When he took another step, the beast pressed itself against the invisible wall. It let out a threatening growl, hiss, gurgle, but its body gave the truth away. It was scared of him, IG realized. For a long moment, he stood there, contemplating that new information. Of course. He thought, eyes widening. It was just born, it doesn't know anything at all. A very confused and very powerful creature, no wonder it wreaked havoc here. Our attempts to contain it probably didn't help with that either, not that we could have done something different. The question for now was, could he use this information? Probably. Changing his approach a little, tried to project calm and assurance. Not only with his body language and expression but also literally. He didn't know how well that would work since he'd never attempted such a thing, but he'd made some crazy stuff happen in his mindscape. Surely this wasn't too crazy, right? Evidently, something worked, because he could see the beast relaxing. Not much, but it was noticeable, at least. Now, how to go from here? That's it, guy, for now. Hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.